Okay,
we can start.
Then we can start. Yeah, we can start. So, or we can finish. Finish the whole thing now. Wrap it up. Last 50 minutes, 40 minutes, isn't it? I guess we can go on as long as we like, right? Because there's nothing after this. So when does this building close? When does it finish? So I'm going to talk about extending teams, the developer's tale. Okay, originally I submitted a couple of talks, and there was another one, and I can't remember what it was called anymore. It was something like extending teams, the administrator's tale, or maybe the apothecary's tale, or something like that. I can't remember. So this one's left a bit dangling now as a title. Doesn't quite make so much sense. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the development topics for teams, and quite a few people have sort of struggled with this, and they're sort of, don't know, not quite sure where to start. So I'll talk about the various options that we have for Teams development. So I've only got 40 minutes, so there isn't really enough time to go into any depth. So I'll just sort of skate over. I'll do some very quick demos, just an intro. I'm not going to be able to go all the way. And I'm also going to assume that since this is a Teams conference, that everybody here knows what Teams looks like and have used all these applications and things. So, you know what the end result looks like. You're just interested in how do you build that yourself. So that's me. No time to spend on that, except I'm Bill. So that's all you need to know. And I'll talk a little bit about why we'd want to extend Teams, all these different options, tabs, connectors, messaging extensions, bots, webhooks. I'll talk a little bit about the SharePoint framework if there's enough time at the end, and then we'll kind of wrap up, and then we'll all go home. And really, the question is, why would you want to build on Microsoft Teams? Well, there's 200 million plus people out there using it. And where users are, that's a good place to get your applications. If you want to get stuff into the hands of users, this is always a problem with software development, is how do you make it platform independent so it will work on this phone and this device and that device. Well, if you can target an application people have already got installed, it makes it a lot easier for you in terms of getting it out to users. And that's the case with Teams. That's why web development has taken off over the last 20 years, because everybody happens to have a web browser installed on their computer. Well, they've also probably got Teams. The people we're interested in have probably got Teams installed. So it's a great way of delivering some capability to people on the platform they're already using, the place they are every day. So we're not saying you have to install this separate thing and run this other application. You're in Teams, you can carry on in Teams. There are automated deployment mechanisms, so you can push that out to users, so it's just there where they want it. It's all the security and everything like that is built in. We don't have to reinvent all that stuff. It's a pretty easy development model, so it's built on what we already do with web development, and they've got very wide choice of development technique that you can use. So if you come from an ASP.NET background, that's fine, you can use that. If you're a JavaScript developer, if you use Node.js, even if you're Ruby on Rails or all these other platforms, you can carry on using those if you want to. I'll give my recommendations. Other things being equal, what I think is a good set of tools to use, but you can basically use anything you like. And the fact is, sometimes you can do things with Power Platform, but that's not always sufficient. So Power Platform can do all the tricks, but sometimes you need to use real magic, right? You actually use magic to achieve these things. So here's the marketing sound effects. The flashy marketing slide looks great, all these different extension points, but when you come to this, it kind of looks like this. What do I do? What does this button do? Is that red button there? Is that the microphone talk button, or is it the guns? I can't quite remember. So it's all these different extension options, particularly in Teams. They've given us a lot of places where we can extend and add our own code. But all of these things in Microsoft 365 work the same way. So whether you're building extensions for Office with Office add-ins, or you're building extensions to SharePoint, your intranet, or whether you're building for Teams. So documents means these Office documents, Excel worksheets and Word documents and PowerPoint decks. Pages is your intranet SharePoint pages, and then conversations is really Teams. So these are the canvases. A useful way of thinking about it is these different canvases in Microsoft 365 where we can deploy our stuff, get our applications working. And the key to it all is a manifest file. In the case of Teams, it's a JSON manifest file, and that wires up to some endpoint that we talk to, which could be, if we're delivering UI and content, that will be a web endpoint. If we were delivering, say, a bot for a conversation, it's going to be a service endpoint, a REST endpoint that we're going to talk to. But it's the same idea. We have to host that somewhere. It doesn't really matter what technology we use to host it, as long as it's out there on the public internet somewhere that we can get to. And then that gets rendered inside whatever the application is. So in the case of Teams, it will be it's somewhere in Teams, various places we can extend that will surface whatever we've built and whatever web-based content we've got. And then the manifest file is just a JSON file, and this one has it's got the name, your developer name, and some IDs and a few other bits of sort of metadata. And then there's a number of these sections. The first one we've got here, which is static tabs at the bottom there. That's one of the types of tabs we can build. And there's a number of these sections that we can add, depending on what feature we want to, or where we want to extend Teams. And in fact, we can build an application that extends Teams in multiple places if we want to. So we can have tabs and a bot and a messaging extension all in the same application. Sometimes it makes sense to do that. And then the development tools, well, as I say, you could use any number of web development tools, but most people in web development nowadays are using this modern web development tool chain where they're using things like command line tools like Gulp and NPM inside Node.js, which is essentially JavaScript running on the server, which can also be used as a development platform. Tools like this one is actually React, which is a JavaScript framework. A lot of people using TypeScript, a lot of people using Visual Studio Code, incidentally, not just people on the Microsoft stack, people generally using Visual Studio Code because it's a good editor. Not so much Visual Studio, that's more of a sort of a Microsoft tool chain thing, but Visual Studio Code is very, very widely used. So if you want to build one of these extensions, we could use a tool inside Teams called App Studio. So it's one of the options you can do in the left rail. You can go to App Studio, install it, and run that. And that's really just a manifest editor, which is kind of giving way now to this developer portal. So they've rebuilt that as another tool called Developer Portal, which is a website that you can do to. But it's really just a manifest editor. Whereas if you use something like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code or the Yeoman generator, which is a command line generator, I'll quickly show it in a minute, then what you're building is scaffolding out a complete application. And that includes the web-based part, whether that's a bot and it's creating a web endpoint, or whether it's it's content for a tab, in which case it's a website. Okay, so I would recommend Visual Studio Code as the best tool to do this. That's what I tend to use. You can use Visual Studio. That will steer you down the ASP.NET C# sort of path. Visual Studio Code, quick install, a much easier tool in terms of its footprint on your computer. And use that with Node.js and build, and it will scaffold out more of a JavaScript, TypeScript type of project for you. Similarly with the Yeoman generator, which is a command line tool. There isn't an editor, but it will just do the scaffolding. So this is what Visual Studio Code looks like. It's actually a web application, interestingly enough, all built on top of web technology. And there's an extension for Visual Studio Code called Teams Toolkit, which in my experience is by far the easiest way of building one of these things. It gets around a lot of the fairly tricky things you have to set up. There are tools built into the Teams toolkit. So at the moment, that's by far the best tool in terms of what its capabilities are in getting you up and running fairly quickly. And then you can say, I can build a tab or a bot or a messaging extension with that. Just those three. It doesn't really cover the other types of extension I talked about, but those are the three main ones which are sort of has built-in support for. If you use Yeoman, then you're at the command line and you're going old school, and it gives you a few questions, and then you can choose a tab or a bot or a connector, a few other options here, and a messaging extension. And these are not mutually exclusive. They're not radio buttons. You can check as many of these as you want, and it'll produce a project for you and scaffold out, generate a project. A bit like in Visual Studio, you do file new project if you use that tool. It's just the same sort of job. Now, again, language, you can choose any language that you like, really, because you're just building a web application. Again, I personally prefer the sort of going down the JavaScript, TypeScript route, which might sound surprising. I actually think JavaScript is actually quite a well-designed language, very capable. I wouldn't say that's a mainstream view in the development community, but you know, I enjoy using JavaScript. I would never have thought 20 years ago that I'd end up using JavaScript and it would become one of the most important programming languages. It used to be a little bit of a joke in the web development community and elsewhere. I mean, some people, it's not to their taste, but I think if you take a fresh look at JavaScript, weird thing is a lot of the problems, so there were a few mistakes. Poor guy only had a fortnight to write JavaScript back in 1993 or whenever it was. Brendan Ike. I think he did a pretty good job on the whole, and a lot of the problems have been fixed. TypeScript is even better, and a lot of the techniques that we use now routinely were actually always in the language all the time. You know, it's an object-oriented language. It's just not classical, so it confuses people. So if you haven't looked at JavaScript recently, I would say have another look and understand how it works. Yes, you can use classes, or you can use its native inheritance model, which is prototypal inheritance. If you understand that, I think it will make a lot more sense. If you think it's a sort of a slightly dodgy classical, as in classes language, then it will seem quite strange. So they have added those features later. But they weren't really a native part of the language as it was originally designed. But you don't have to, but I would suggest that you look at that, because I think that you'll find a lot of samples and a lot of examples. And similarly, when it comes to client-side rendering, you could use anything you like for when you're rendering UI. But I would suggest that React.js at the moment, and Microsoft have tried to be fairly agnostic. But they do have a lot of React components which you can then take advantage of and build solutions with that. So, I mean, again, it's one of these things where if you don't use React, it looks horrible and strange, and it takes a while to get the hang of it, like any technology that you're not familiar with. But I think it's worth investing the effort into it. But if you've spent the last 20 years doing, well, it couldn't be 20 years, spent the last 5 years doing Angular development, I wouldn't suggest you just change just for the sake of it, but or other things being equal. So tabs for collaboration. So we can host a website inside a tab in Teams. I mean, that's about the easiest way we can extend Teams. And that gives us a way is if we've got something like a corporate website that does something, we can just put it right into Teams very simply. I mean, the simplest way would be to simply add it as a website. There's a website component that you can add. And there's an example here of, so this is a customizable tab that's been added to a team. That's one way of doing it. You can also add a different kind of tab that is a static tab that will just sit. It's like your own personal application as well. So you go to the left rail and you say, I'm installing this on my particular instance of Teams. Whereas if you go for the configurable tab, which I showed on the last one, you add that to a team or a conversation or something like that, and it's there for everybody who goes to that site. So they're slightly different things, and the terminology is a little bit confusing because in the manifest file, the configurable tabs are the Teams tabs that you know, give you another tab in your team or your channel, whereas the static tabs are the ones where you add it like your own personal application inside there. So you have to kind of just map those two things, as so often happens in technology teams, especially Microsoft technology, is the marketing department come up with one name and the developers come up with a different name, and then there's this slight mismatch, and so you have to do this sort of mental mapping. It's not quite as bad as SharePoint sites and site collections, but and webs, but yeah, it's a source of confusion. So we can add I'll just mime here and pretend I'm actually doing this because it isn't my machine. But yeah, we can let's just reuse the Zoom on this. I shouldn't say the word Zoom, should I, at a Teams conference? So we can add, one of the types of tab we can add is a built-in one, which is a website. So you simply go in and you look for a website, and then, so this is a configurable tab, so we're now configuring it. So there's a configuration page, and we say this is you could build this yourself if you wanted to, but you don't need to because there's already one here. And we can add the URL, and then it will go to my my blog page, and I can have that right inside this team. And the drawback here is that's not really, I didn't really build anything. I just, it's up to the user to configure that. That's not really an application that I'm deploying. So I can do a bit better than that. Is we can actually build something. Here's something we could just do using App Studio or the developer portal, increasingly as we sort of migrate to that. And we can go into App Studio or whichever tool it is and say, right, okay, great, let's open one of these existing ones, and you've got this nice sort of user interface where you can set the tabs up, for example, and bots and connectors, and you're just doing configuration. You haven't built anything at the back end. You'd have to do that separately, but you might already have that. And you can look at the actual JSON that it's generated. So all it's doing is generating this JSON file. It's still up to you to build something at the back end that it's going to talk to. And then there are tools in there to help you deploy it or to sideload it so you can test it and so forth. That's the developer portal, which is basically the same thing. It just gives you a slightly newer version of it that's hosted as a website as opposed to a Teams app. So we've now seen a configurable tab, which is the website one, and this is App Studio is actually a personal tab type of application. So that's what's the other thing we were going to look at? Visual Studio Teams Toolkit, and the Yeoman generator will do the same thing if we were to run that. So if I go into Teams, if I go into Visual Studio Code and add the Teams Toolkit, which is one of the extensions for Visual Studio Code, then we can do things like create a new Teams app here, and it gives you a few menus and things. There are some sample apps that they've set up. There's hundreds of samples as well that you can get as a good way to start this kind of development project is to start with a sample that does something close to what you want. There's a bunch of them on docs.microsoft.com. In this case, we'll select JavaScript, and when we hit the button and choose a folder, so I'm going to put it in my projects Teams folder, just so I don't lose track of all this stuff. And we'll give it a name, so we'll call it My Tab 2. So that's something exciting and interesting and original. And now it goes off and it scaffolds out this project. So it's generated this file structure and we're now ready to go, and we can then sort of, you can run this, test it, run it locally, and then start developing it and developing the functionality. But it's so in Visual Studio Code, it's not like there's no project file as such, it's just a directory structure. And this is the manifest file. Now there's a manifest file and there are two PNG files. That is your app package. They get zipped up into an app package. That's all that's in there. So when you deploy an app, what you're really deploying is this app package that's got the two icons and this JSON file that says, kind of wires everything up together. Okay, and then in here they've actually, for the starter project, this is actually using React, so it's calling in index.jsx React DOM render, and then we've got a components folder, and there's a tab here which has got just a bit of starter logic in there that shows a welcome message, and there's a config page set up for you as well, where you can configure something that's specific to that instance of the configurable tab when it's created. So that's the idea anyway, is that it's built out the back end that it's going to show as well, and in this case it's going to push everything. When you build it, it'll push it into another folder, and then you can then publish it wherever you want to. So typically, what a lot of us would do is we'd then create either an Azure web app, or we could even create an Azure static site, or even potentially use a CDN to distribute that as well. So that's how we're doing for time. Just 15 minutes left, or? Yeah. Okay, let's look at Teams bots very quickly. And Teams bots are there now. So we've talked about tabs, which are really rendering a UI from a web page. When we talk about bots, this is conversational UI. This was super popular and talked about 3 or 4 years ago at Ignite. Everybody was talking about bots. I think it was driven by all the progress in natural language processing. So you can have bots that are all, can kind of get the intent when you say, what time is it? Or what's the time? It knows. You don't have to spell every possibility out. And so it became much more practical to have quite good chat bots, or using text or using voice. So everybody got excited about bots. And yes, of course, you can have bots in Teams as well. So typically what we do in Teams is we'd mention the bot, and then you start a little conversation with it, a text conversation. So this is what we build with Teams bots, but the back end isn't a website, it's a REST endpoint. This REST web service endpoint, which sounds very simple, is actually a little bit more complicated, because there's quite a complex JSON packets that are sent backwards and forwards to get this working correctly. And typically these get implemented, the REST endpoint is implemented using the bot framework. So the bot framework is a set of different language APIs. There's a C# one, there's a JavaScript one, there's a Python one, and various other languages, and all the libraries behind that. And also there's a bot registration service inside Azure, which will wire the bot up to various things, that you might want to connect it to. One of those things, of course, is Teams. So the bot framework isn't just for, it's not just for Teams. It's for designed to do many of these different services. So like Cortana, for example. So this is what the JSON requests. It's a bit of an eye test this, but this is what the JSON request looks like. So it's got to be structured in just this way. So you could write something yourself from scratch. You like the? I told you that you witchcraft in your session. You could write this yourself. I was going to say it's not witchcraft. You could write it yourself, but a better path to take is to just use the bot framework, because they've figured all this stuff out and it'll just work. So bot framework is It's designed to do all these different things. It's got all this AI magic behind it to make it, make the conversations seem natural. We're not trying to trick people into thinking they're talking to a real human being, but just we want to understand what they mean so that we can get as much value out of this as possible. So if it's some sort of website call center, then you want to minimize the number of times people have to speak to a real agent. And then as you can see, Teams is just one of these many channels that you can wire the bot into. Once you've built one of these bots, it can be used in multiple places. But if we want to build one for Teams, we'll have to build the back end for it as well. So the process of building a bot is we've got to use the bot framework to implement this web service, but we've also got to register it in Azure AD. We've got to register the bot with the bot service or bot registration service, which is a separate thing. So that's two things you have to do. And then you've got to get all the right IDs and secrets mapping between them to make everything work. It's quite involved. And then you've also, if you want to test it, normally you're going to be testing it on your own machine, so you don't have a public endpoint. And if you want to test it in Teams, there has to be a publicly accessible endpoint. And so what you have to do is use something like a tool called ngrok, is what usually gets mentioned in this context, which will give you a public URL that you can go to, and it routes it back into your machine quite cleverly. I actually use one called Local Tunnel, which is a little bit easy to use because you don't have to pay for the premium one in order to keep the address that you've set up. So those three steps there are the ones that give people a lot of trouble, and it does seem like witchcraft, that bit, I have to admit. But the tooling inside the Teams toolkit has ironed a lot of that out for you. So you can go in Teams toolkit, and we'll see this in a minute, and it will kind of set that up without you having to spend a huge amount of time trying to get all these different things right, and then you get one tiny thing wrong and the whole thing doesn't work and it gets frustrating. So nobody wants that. Nobody wants to spend time trying to figure that out. So this is Local Tunnel. Just you need to do an npm install -g local tunnel, and then it will simply, you just say, okay, Local Tunnel, I want the name My App. You've got to, there's a chance that somebody will have taken My App already, but then you just pick another one and say, and then I want to listen on port 3000. So I've got my app, my bot application running on my local machine on port 3000, and Local Tunnel is going to say, well, anything that comes into whatever that address is, myapp.loca.lt, will go into my port 3000 on my local machine. And so that myapp.loca.it is the address that you can now give Teams and say that's where you're going to go for your bot. That's what goes in the manifest file for testing. And then when you deploy it, you're going to deploy it into Azure or somewhere for real. Testing it is quite tricky. So those are the real three trouble areas. And so if we create a new Teams app using the Teams toolkit in Visual Studio, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, then we can again choose. I'm going to choose JavaScript, select a folder, and it's going to go off and do a very similar thing and generate some code. And I was going to spend a bit of time looking at the code, but I think I probably won't bother on this occasion because we've got about 10 minutes left, I think. And then again, it's scaffolded out a project, but it's a slightly different project now. So it's not a website type project, it's a web service endpoint. So if I go to this file here, T, which is the right one, that's the package JSON, which shows all the different packages that it's installed for us that we're going to use. Because in this case, we're going to use the bot framework, which is quite a big API. And then this index.js file, this is what I wanted to show. You can see down here is it's going to run an HTTP server and listen on this address here, whatever myapp.loca.it, and then /API messages. That's the endpoint that I will end up giving Teams, and then once it gets a message through there, so you mention the bot in Teams, and it will then send the message through to this activity handler, which has been built because it extends that Teams activity handler, a special activity handler in the bot framework specifically for doing Teams. And then you've got your starting code, which will work. I mean, we're not going to go. It takes a little bit longer than we've got really time for here to actually set that up. And you might have seen inside there were these things called adaptive cards, which we tend to use. It's another technology that we tend to use in a number of places in Microsoft. They created these cards, which is a quick way of generating some content. So a bot can present a UI to the user. So it might present a card or it might present some HTML, but cards are a good way of doing that because it's cross-platform and they're used everywhere in Microsoft 365 now. So there's this one standard. And then the Teams toolkit, things buzzing, that's a bad sign. It's trying to tell me something. Teams toolkit then has a provision in the cloud button. Now, I'm not going to go through those steps, but if you go through that, it will sort out all those, getting all those IDs right and everything, and register it in Azure and in Azure AD and get it all set up. Now, introduction to messaging extensions. So you'll know that a messaging extension is those things when you're in a chat. It's not quite a bot. It's something that will typically what you'd use it for is I want to look something up and then refer to it in the message. And that's the kind of tool that we'd add there. Sometimes you build something that appears as a messaging extension and a bot, and there's a page. It depends what you're trying to build. But the messaging extension is another section in the manifest. So they're helpfully called compose extensions in the manifest file. Nothing really matches up between the world of the names of products and features and what it's called in the manifest file. But so you've got to keep that mapping in your mind. And then this next step, which is building the messaging extension, you'll notice exactly the same as the bot, because essentially it's a bot with a slightly different subtle set of differences, but essentially a messaging extension is a type of bot that's running on the back end. It's just invoked in a different way and you interact with it slightly differently, but it's essentially the same thing. So there's another section in Teams Toolkit for setting up a messaging extension that takes you through the same path pretty much, but the structure of the project will be slightly different for a messaging extension. Okay, I'll just very quickly talk about webhooks. So we've got connectors. Well, let's not worry about task modules are just another way of presenting a UI. If you've got a bit more than you can get into an adaptive card, a task module is a good way of popping up a modal bit of UI to the user. Incoming and outgoing webhooks. So we've got connectors, which are available across Microsoft 365, and they have their own development story. But if you want to do something very quickly, we've got incoming and outgoing webhooks. So a webhook is where we want to do polling. If we did polling, we've got the problem of how often do you poll, and it's inefficient, so we tend to use webhooks, which are a way of a sort of publish and subscribe model. And so you can say, let me know when this list changes or something like that. And so the incoming webhooks are really where I want to send notifications into Teams to let it know that something's happened, and it's a sort of a much more lightweight way of doing it than a connector, which is a bit more overhead. It has to be registered with. There's a whole process around that, but the incoming webhooks, if you want to do something a little bit simpler, that's a better way of doing it. And similarly, the outgoing webhooks do much the same job as a bot, but without the complexity and overhead of building a bot. So I like to think of incoming and outgoing webhooks as sort of lightweight connectors, lightweight bots, pretty easy to do. And you can sort of set them up through the user interface. The incoming ones, there's like a special connector that you can use, and then there's if you go into the UI, there's a way of setting up the outgoing webhooks as well. So those connectors are everywhere in Microsoft 365. Task modules, I'm going to quick that. These are like these modal dialogues, really easy to invoke from code. This one other thing I wanted to talk about quickly was that we can use the SharePoint framework. So if you're a SharePoint developer and you want to reuse those skills, then you can use the SharePoint framework. Well, there are a number of advantages actually in doing that. So we can render SharePoint web parts in a SharePoint page. We can also register them in Teams now. And you just go through the same Yeoman generator. Typically we use a Yeoman generator for SharePoint projects, but there's a couple of changes that we can make in the supported hosts field in the SharePoint framework manifest. You can tell a SharePoint framework package you're going to be able to be installed in Teams, and once you do that, it lights up this button in the SharePoint app gallery. And your SharePoint framework web part can now be installed as a team. It will be available then in Teams to install. So that's another way of building something. If you're already familiar with a SharePoint framework, it solves a number of the problems around getting access to Microsoft Graph. That's made pretty easy. There are lots of tooling around that. So that's just to wrap up. Just a few hints and tips. When you're designing these things, a good plan is to try and focus on something fairly specific, not try and build the application that can do everything. That really, from experience, that doesn't work out so well. It's better to focus on one particular task for the user that will solve some specific problem, particularly a business problem. I think the sweet spot for this is, yes, you can do this as an ISV if you want to build a product that you're going to sell. But I think inside businesses, if you have some development resources, you can build something that solves a particular business problem for users inside Teams. Right where they're going to need it, they can just click on it and get to whatever service you provisioned inside your intranet or whatever it is. You can bring that to them rather than make them go to the browser and find this site, and so make things easier for them. And focus on the key tasks rather than trying to brand it and making it, like your intranet. A lot of people that go a bit crazy on branding the intranet. Not a good practice in this case, I would suggest. Try and keep things as simple as possible. Make it look as though it's part of Teams. So tabs gives you a nice big user interface if that's what you need. Bots are for when you want to do things in a chat context. Some tasks that you want people who are conversing to be able to get at. Not so good for something that involves first do this, and then once I have that information, do this next thing, and then once I've gathered that information, do the next thing. That doesn't work so well as a bot, like a conversation. Then you might go into a task module or have a tab or something like that. Connectors are the sort of more formally managed connections where you want to make something that's reusable, maybe even sell. Webhooks, a little bit more ad hoc, but easy to set up. Messaging extensions, when you want to get some information in the context of a chat, that's an ideal opportunity to use a messaging extension to deliver that functionality. As I say, if you've got some more complex interaction, that's sometimes when you need a task module, because you can then pop up much larger UI for somebody to interact with. So, productivity booster team, because people are in Teams, if we can deliver the functionality that we want to give them inside Teams, it will get it's more natural, just part of their normal workflow. It'll get used. That's always a problem with building applications, is trying to make sure people use them. So if it's there, there's a much better chance that it'll be used. You can use any technology you want. I've told you what my preference is, but there's nothing stopping you using whatever technology you're already using. It's you've got access to the whole of the Microsoft 365 platform through the Microsoft Graph. And so, you know, if you don't like JavaScript, I'd say, you know, think again. give it a chance. You know, you might, and React. And I do actually have a course on LinkedIn Learning where I go into a lot more depth than I can go into this. So if you're lucky enough to have a LinkedIn Learning subscription, then you can get more. And here's some resources. So that's about all I can cram into 41 minutes on the topic without hesitation, deviation, or repetition. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, remote viewers as well, or if you're tuning in later. And I've thoroughly enjoyed Commsverse, so thanks to the organisers. It's been a great 2 days. So
thank you, Bill. That
again.
was an amazing session. So thank you very much, our virtual attendees. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Otherwise, so let's say goodbye to Commsverse. That was an amazing journey after a couple of years.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm just closing the meeting. Take care and hope to see you soon.